I'm Edward Rock. I teach at NYU Law School, and I'm the director of the Institute for Corporate Governance and Finance there. And along with Mike Callahan from Stanford's Rock Center, I want to welcome everybody to this conference. It's really a wonderful conference that, both in its conception and in its organization, is really the brainchild of Leo Strine, who we will hear from later. Leo has spent his career as a corporate law judge, but with a view that's much broader than trying to solve the agency costs of the separation of ownership and control. He has a conception of corporate law that is, I think, probably an older and deeper and more traditional conception, which is corporate law, first and foremost, is about building great firms. And building great firms is important not for itself, but because it builds a great society. And that link between the good of society and the governance arrangements is really at the core of this conference. And it's an attempt to imagine what we could do if we had the political will to try to make the economy work for everybody. So to do that, of course, even if one loves corporate law as I do, there's a recognition that you have to look beyond corporate law to solve problems, however good corporate law is at solving corporate law problems. And so the scope of this conference is absolutely mind-boggling. And the focus of it, I think, is really a wonderful focus, especially for academics, which is not to write 90 pages about your view of X, Y, and Z, but to come up with a focused policy recommendation to make the world a better place, which is a wonderful way to focus the mind and to produce something that is potentially of value. So I'm going to get out of the way because I really want to hear the proceedings today. But let me introduce my colleague, Mike Callahan from Stanford.
Thanks, Ed. Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Rock Center, Stanford, and my colleague, Professor Joe Grunfest, who will join us later this evening, we'd like to welcome and thank you for being a part of this important discussion. I really want to thank Professor Rock and his colleagues at NYU and all the sponsors for putting in all the work to put this together. My job is to introduce the moderator for our first panel, and before I do that, I'd like to thank two people who've been instrumental, Gabe Horowitz of Third Way and Nell Abernathy of the Roosevelt Institute, for their help in putting together this first discussion, which is called Investments in Our Economic Future 1, Revitalizing Our Physical Infrastructure. Our moderator of this panel is Roy SWAN, who's the Director of Mission Investments at the Ford Foundation, where he leads the team managing Ford's mission-related and project-related investments. Before the Ford Foundation, Mr. SWAN was Managing Director and Co-Head of Global Sustainable Finance at Morgan Stanley, where he committed over $13 billion in community development transactions. He served on many nonprofit boards as well as executive roles in community development organizations and has had a long career in corporate law and investment banking prior to his current role. So please join me in welcoming Mr. SWAN, and I'll let you take it from here. Thank you.
Great. This thing on? Can you all hear me? Mic on? Okay, great. Well, whoever said that infrastructure was boring had not heard from this set of panelists, and I just want to make an observation. Normally, we save the best for last, but I think they threw us a curveball this time and decided to go with the best first. So I want to thank you all for having me here today, and I'm joined by this set of esteemed panelists. And before I say anything else, I'm going to grab my notes. Thank God for notes, because without notes, I am completely lost. So I first want to give a very quick overview of the way this panel, the way we've structured it here. The first thing I'm going to do is give a brief introduction of the panelists. Then I'm going to go to an opening question. It's going to be a compound question preceded by a provocative statement. Then they will be given 1 minute each to respond, and then I will summarily cut them off. Next will be a lightning round of topics where each of the panelists will tell us what is the most important infrastructure issue or topic to them and why. Once again, they'll have 1 minute to describe that, and it seems unfair that I will be cutting them off. But then what we're going to do is we're going to circle back, and each of them will have an opportunity to raise that question again, and there'll be a discussion here among the panelists. They'll compare, contrast, discuss, debate, and whatever else they'd like to do with each of the questions. That'll go for about 7 minutes each. We'll then open it up for audience Q&A, and finally remarks, the closing remarks by each of the panelists. So first I'll start with introductions. To my immediate left, your right, Beth Osborne is the Director of Transportation for America. She's had a distinguished career at the U.S. Department of Transportation, where she served as Acting Assistant Secretary for Transportation Policy and Deputy Assistant Secretary for Transportation Policy. Before that, she worked for Senator Tom Carper. And we got a shout out here from the good Supreme Court Justice. And also as an advisor for transportation, trade, labor policy. And before that, she was a legislative assistant for Representative Ron Klink and legislative director for Representative Brian Baird. Next is Larry Willis, who is the president of the transportation trades at the APL-CIO, which goes without further introduction, but it's a labor organization consisting of 32 unions that together represent workers in all areas of transportation. Larry oversees daily operations and serves as the organization's spokesperson and chief strategist. Before becoming president of Transportation Trades, Larry held numerous other positions at the organization, including secretary-treasurer, general counsel, and legislative representative. Early in his career, Larry was an associate and director of legislation for Weil, Gotshal & Manges and served in various legislative roles on Capitol Hill and political campaigns. Next is Damon Drummer, who flew in this morning, left his 2-year-old in Chicago. He is co-founder and executive director of New Consensus. He's had some innovative civic work, which has been recognized by the Obama White House, Code for America, and the Aspen Institute. Damon's notable projects include Coder Source, a computer science learning lab where high school students develop leadership skills for a changing world, and largelots.org, a community-driven effort to reclaim and repurpose city-owned vacant lots in Chicago. And to my far left, Kevin DeGood, the Director of Infrastructure Policy at the Center for American Progress. Kevin's work focuses on how infrastructure policy and investments can help improve social equity, environmental performance, and economic competitiveness. He holds a Master of Public Policy degree from the University of Southern California and is the author of Thinking Outside the Fare Box, Creating Approaches to Financing Transit Projects. I love that title of that book. So now for the compound question preceded by a provocative statement. I read, I think it was a Bipartisan Policy Center, they had a snippet that said 185 million people a day cross a bridge that is structurally deficient. And so my question here is, if infrastructure is so important, why is nothing happening? And I don't mean that literally, but literally, why is nothing happening? And if people, why don't people care about infrastructure, and how can we make them care? So if you can take any part of that statement or question for your minute each, I welcome you to do that.
So I would point out initially that the transportation program is trust funded, so even if the government shuts down, something is happening. We're spending over $50 billion a year from the federal government no matter what happens, and the appropriators can't touch it. So we're doing a lot. We're just not spending it to repair any of those bridges because the program doesn't require us to. And why does the program not require us to? Because the only priority of both parties is to spend money in their state. It's not to spend money in their state to any particular end.
Yep. Thank you. Larry?
Well, 1 minute. A lot to say here. Look, from our perspective, as Roy mentioned, we represent 32 unions that in turn represent workers in all areas and modes of transportation. And we are full, partners in this infrastructure discussion Because at the end of the day, we understand that when you make the right investments, and we can talk about in this panel about what that means, and really rebuilding this country's vast infrastructure from our perspective, our transportation network, you are really creating the right kind of jobs that we think are so urgently needed in this economy. Yes, the construction jobs get a lot of attention, and they should. Those are important. But what is left behind are good jobs for entities that are providing those transportation services. And because whether you're talking about transit, freight, or passenger rail, airports, U.S. seaports, even on the maritime side with U.S. vessels, you have tremendous high union density in those sectors. So obviously you're earning on average 13% more if you're a union worker versus a non-union worker. And if you are really interested in closing that wage gap, which I know is a big discussion today, one of the things that you can do is make these types of targeted and consistent investments. We can talk again about what that means, but if you want to create good jobs, this is a great way to do it.
So I live in Chicago, so I don't have an answer for why Washington doesn't work in that way. But I'm happy to make commentary on it. So at New Consensus, we're working on the Green New Deal, and we're calling for massive investments in a ton of national projects, including upgrading America's infrastructure. Not just upgrading our infrastructure to what it is now and what it was in the past, but really making sure that we're making the right investments that really make us more adaptable and resilient for climate breakdown as it's happening, and to shift away from the types of practices and modalities of transportation that led us into this crisis. And so those types of projects will create many, many jobs, well-paying jobs that stick around and equip this country to compete economically in the future. So we're calling for massive public investments, and perhaps maybe a crisis, whether a climate crisis or a coming economic crisis might be a stimulus, so to speak, to break that logjam.
Yeah, I think to Beth's point, we have to understand that the program doesn't really have a clearly defined purpose these days. When the federal government got into the business of making substantial investments in infrastructure, it was to complete what we have now, which is the interstate highway system. I think, but since that time, we've been a little adrift, and we've kept the basic federal-state partnership in place without giving it a newfound purpose. So part of the reason why we have so many structurally deficient bridges is that we don't tell states they have to fix them. We provide states with near total discretion over what they do with federal dollars. As long as they're spending those dollars on an eligible activity, they can do whatever they want. And our political system is, not surprisingly, it rewards people when they build new things. It doesn't particularly reward politicians when they fix old things that we already have. So maintenance gets pushed off when a shiny new interchange on the ex-urban fringe gets a ribbon cutting, because that's what somebody thinks is going to help them out politically. So I think we have to recognize the sort of perverse incentives that push people away from maintenance, and we have to put some real sticks into the federal program to require that sort of stuff. But I think more broadly, we have to step back and stop just asking how much are we spending, because that's 99.9% of what Washington argues about, is exactly how much are we spending, and try to say, what are we trying to achieve? And Center for American Progress believes that in addition to creating lots of well-paying jobs, one of the things we have to be achieving is dramatic reductions in our mobile source emissions in the transportation sector, and dramatic improvements in terms of increasing access to opportunity and reducing transportation costs at a household level, right? And all of those things are fit together, but we have to start from a position of recognizing that the program that we have can't get us there, and it needs some very deep structural reforms.
And a quick plug, if you're interested in how your state is spending its money, we did a report on this earlier this year called Repair Priorities, which you can find on our website, and it breaks down the spending on maintenance versus new, particularly on roads and bridges across the nation, and you will find that there's a wide variety, everything from one state that is spending only 4%, that's Massachusetts, 4% on expanding its system, and the rest is on maintenance, versus other states where it's the exact reverse.
Thanks, everyone. We're now going to move to our lightning round, where I want each panelist to spend no more than a minute to talk about what is the most important topic or issue around infrastructure and why. And I'd like all of you to remember what you say, because I'm definitely not going to remember. And because when we come back, each of you, we're going to have that internal debate. And for the audience, if you're not already doing it, just this would be a good time to start jotting down some of those questions for the Q&A session. So we'll start with Beth.
So I'm going to sound a little bit like a broken record, and it is moving from a conversation about money to a conversation about outcomes. And frankly, any outcome would make me happy at this point. We talk about maintaining the current system before building new things. We talk about safety and providing access to jobs and services, which is not a priority of our system at all. The priority is to make cars move fast. Whether or not you arrive is incidental. But if I had to pick a priority out of those three, it would be safety and reducing the number of people killed and injured on our roadways. Right now, we kill 35,000 people a year, and we injure 3 million, and we do that because you all have to save a few seconds, and that's our priority.
Well, look, there's no question safety is everyone's priority when you're talking about a transportation system, and I think the outcome discussion, depending on what part of investments you're talking about, we should always want the right outcomes in these investments. We just don't want to build the whole to build the whole, right? But I would push back that I think from our perspective, the funding levels are a real problem. We have not raised the federal gas tax since 1993. You're trying to operate, a 2019 infrastructure and transportation system on a budget that, again, has not been touched one iota. You've got more fuel-efficient vehicles on the road, which obviously is a good thing, but that puts even more downward pressure on the amount of money. Since 2008, the Highway Trust Fund has basically been insolvent. It's required transfers from the general fund, which have been needed at the time, but for the long-run sustainability of the system, we have got to figure out a way to get real federal dollars in and out of the Highway Trust Fund. We've talked about doing a modest increase for a gas tax. We're open to sort of other ideas or a mixture of that. But that's really the hard discussion. And quite frankly, you asked earlier about why this hasn't gotten done. It's a sort of the failure of policymakers to figure out about how to get more revenues into the trust fund.
I'd say the most pressing issue is funding for public transportation in two ways. One, that 80-20 split of 80% of federal transportation dollars go to highways, 20% for transit. We know transit's the future. Everybody loves it. But also, that 20% can only be built or used for infrastructure. 70% of local transit agencies, 70% of their costs are operations. So allowing those federal dollars to be used for operations can lower fares, increase ridership, and we know how that works. So I think that's what I would contribute.
I think the single largest issue is climate change. I'll just throw out one stat. America's light-duty vehicle fleet, I got to pull this number off the top of my head, maybe 275 million vehicles, something like that, light-duty vehicles. If those light-duty vehicles were a country, they would be the 6th largest emitter on Earth. They would be ahead of Germany and just behind Japan. So,
And that's with new, more fuel-efficient vehicles.
yeah, and that's with new, more fuel-efficient vehicles. That's absolutely right. So we have a staggering planetary-wide challenge. But something that we should remember is that the carbon and carbon equivalents that are up in the atmosphere that are causing the warming we're experiencing, it's mostly our carbon, right? It's our century and a half of industrialization, which has got us to this point. So I think we bear an enormous moral burden to try to make progress on this. And I think, to be quick about it, it's not just about electrification. All too often we default to, you know what, if tomorrow I wake up and I've got a hydrogen fuel cell car or I've got a battery electric plug-in hybrid that I can go a couple hundred miles on, well, doesn't that solve the challenge? The answer to that is absolutely not, because what we also have to remember is that when we build ever outward and when we build more highways and when we drive more, we're cannibalizing greenfield space, right? It's that greenfield space that's been lost. That's the reason why we have 3 billion fewer birds, according to a recent study. It's that loss of greenfield space why we have such toxic, groundwater and drinking water, right?
And fewer trees to absorb the carbon.
Fewer trees to absorb the carbon, right? There are environmental services. There are all sorts of issues here. So we have to recognize that what we build is just as important as the particular drivetrain of the vehicle you might be riding in.
Thanks. Continue our round robin. We're going to circle back to Beth, and we're going to spend about 7 minutes talking about your topic, which I'm sure I will mangle, but it was essentially outcomes versus money. with the overarching
And I
theme of
focus on
safety.
safety, yeah. And I don't agree that safety is anybody's top priority. Our outcomes prove it. The thing that we do when we design a roadway, the only performance measure that the engineers consider is the pace of the vehicles on that roadway. They do not even estimate the number of crashes. If safety were our top priority, they would estimate the number of crashes, look to bring that to zero, monitor it over year to year, and try to fix it. We don't do that. We wait until there's a hot spot. If there's never a hot spot where several crashes occur, we don't even worry about it, even if there's a consistent number of crashes along the corridor. I have trouble viewing that as a concentrated effort to address safety. In fact, if you go out and you watch the way roadways are designed and developed, even here in DC, I recently heard about this going on in some improvements being considered up in the Petworth area. The engineer was saying they couldn't do anything that could interfere with the traffic flow, even if it would save lives, because the priority of our program is to make cars go fast. End of story.
My immediate thought is insurance companies and why there's no involvement there, but I'm not a panelist, so I'm going to try to turn things back over to Larry. Larry, you gave a little, not aggressive pushback, but your topic you raised, I thought, was an interesting counterbalance to what Beth said. Do you have any thoughts on Beth's more expanded viewpoint?
Well, again, I'm not. I think everyone does want a safe transportation system. Our guys obviously, drive the trucks, the buses, in aviation and rail. Obviously, safety is something we think about all the time. But again, if we want to get to sort of better outcomes, and I agree with Beth and Kevin that is something to think about. What those outcomes are, again, we can talk about what those priorities are, but I think you need more money for that. I do think that you can't fix structurally deficient bridges. You can't sort of deal with chronic delays in our transit systems. You can't deal with, for those of us here in DC, when WMATA shuts down because of chronic failure to invest in their system, that takes real federal dollars, and I think is directly related to our failure over the years to put any real additional down payment into the trust fund, to have a real serious conversation about how to get those revenues, how to have adults in the room at the political level. There's a lot of members of Congress up there who think raising the gas tax is political suicide. I think Republicans and Democrats in state after state have demonstrated at the local level that that's not the case. And you've a lot of examples out there of people who have come together politically and get elected just fine. Thank you very much. And I think we need to deal with that at the federal level and really think about, what is the right communication strategy to provide the political cover for those members willing to do that.
Can I agree with Larry on something and then quickly disagree with some of it? One is, we did a study on this issue of states that have raised their gas tax. And we found that 95% of those who voted for the gas tax increase were reelected. In fact, even in Massachusetts, where the public then overturned the gas tax increase, they still reelected the people who voted for the gas tax increase. So the notion that it's political suicide is not borne out by the facts. However, at the state and local level, they have tied that funding more to outcomes than we have at the federal level and to particular projects, which we can't do it to particular projects at the federal level.
We could change that.
But we could do to outcomes for sure. And with our existing funding, we could cut the maintenance backlog in half. Instead, even with the windfall of the Recovery Act, which added double the funding to the program, we dug deeper into the maintenance hole, which is why I say it is irresponsible to talk about money without reforms to the system. Because when you can double your spending and your roads are in worse shape, it is not a spending issue.
I'll throw down two. I completely agree. It's about how much, sure, but it's also about how, right? We can raise more money and allocate more funds and get more of what we have, which isn't what we want. And so how we spend the money matters quite significantly. I'm new to the think tank space, new to the policy space. My background is in undergrad economics, grad school, religion. And so much of these policy conversations fall into the kind of category of doctrine and received tradition. And like we do things a certain way. There's this law that we can change to like open up opportunities and horizons of possibility that can get us more of what we want. And so at New Consensus, we have no track record. So all we're doing is asking questions. And there's so many sacred cows that need to be slayed in order for us to, one, spend money better to get better outcomes and allocate more funds to more of what we want. And hopefully that's public transportation.
So, Damon, with your religion background, you can lead us in prayer for more money and saved. So we'll handle that at the end. Kevin, any thoughts before we move on?
I think that one of the real challenges is that reform means saying that some of what we're doing is bad, right? It means standing up and saying, no, that project's lousy, and what that project's going to achieve is lousy and unworthy of these dollars. And you will often hear, if you are so inclined to follow infrastructure debates in Washington, people wax poetically about the days of yore when everybody came together and kind of hugged and agreed that we would spend more money, and if we could only get back to those days. But the problem with that is that we have real challenges that actually have to be tackled, and just saying, can't we all get along? If you won't call my project lousy, I won't call your project lousy, and we'll both get our projects, and we'll both get reelected, and wouldn't that be great? And the answer is no, not if what we're spending money on is counterproductive to where we need to go, right? If we really want to reduce congestion, then adding an additional, lane to I-95 isn't going to do that. And we know that because we have 5 decades of transportation research that shows that adding lanes of travel to urban highways doesn't actually reduce delay and congestion, right? But that means you'd actually have to say to somebody that their transportation plan was lousy and that what they wanted to do with these federal dollars was not cost effective and not productive. Or if you went out and said, you have a distribution of jobs and housing, which puts some people at a structural disadvantage from gaining higher wages because they can't get to these jobs, or they're forced to bear an incredible time tax of getting up at 4:30 or 5 in the morning because they have to take a series of buses that don't connect very well from where they can afford to live to where the jobs are, then you'd have to say to somebody that they made lousy choices and they need to make different ones. So I think it's incumbent on us to be honest. And I think it's not so much that, at least from my perspective, I don't speak about it, it's not so much that CAP opposes spending more money. We absolutely don't. We want there to be lots more expenditures for infrastructure at the federal level, but only if those expenditures are actually going to achieve progressive ends. And that means we have to stand up and say that some of what we built is shit.
So I think I should cut off now that we've gotten into that type of language. But there was some encroachment, Larry, into I think the key item you raised, which was the spending. Not to say that Beth didn't include spending as a part of her key topic, but I think it's incumbent upon you now to raise your point, and so we can continue this debate and dig a little bit deeper. So what I have in my notes is that you talked about funding levels are insufficient. You point out the gas taxes haven't been raised in some time, et cetera. So I'll turn it back over to you.
Well, again, I think we just had this discussion, but I would just add that if we want to get to that place, if we want to talk about both increased revenues and better outcomes, and look, we represent a bunch of transit workers, obviously. So we think investing more in public transit, sort of is the right answer. We think investments, across the board in transportation are also the right answer. But if we want, to get to both those issues, we have to be able to talk to voters and talk to constituents about these issues in a way that makes sense. And so I think on that point, there's agreement. Structurally deficient bridges are neat, and the grade of the highway, is interesting to me, quite frankly. But I think you'll lose interest, 5 minutes outside the Beltway. Instead, talk about the 2-hour commute that people have to go through to get to their jobs and to see their kids. Talk about the family that lives apart in the town of Des Moines, Iowa, where there's no bus routes. They have to walk a mile just to get to the grocery store. Talk about the truck driver that has to wait in incredibly long lines just to get in and out of the seaport. And they are literally losing dollars because of our failure to invest the right type of infrastructure for that person to get to work. So, talking about real life examples of and the negative impact that both frontline workers and commuters that are also labor union members is what we're trying to focus on as we have this debate in Washington. So that's how we think we get to sort of both these questions.
So if I could, I think your infrastructure example about the port is one that maybe we can make this tension a little more real for people in the audience. If we think about the Port of Los Angeles and the Port of Long Beach, which collectively handle, I forget off the top of my head the exact percentage, maybe 35 or 40% of all imports to the country. It's an incredible percentage, right? If we expand the infrastructure that facilitates the in and out from the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach, we collectively as a nation benefit because we've made our freight system a little bit more efficient, right? That brings down the cost of the goods that we all have on our shelves when we go to the store. But if you're somebody who lives in a house a mile from that port and next to one of the highways that's going to have more of those diesel trucks hauling more of those goods because we've made this port bigger and more efficient, you have a burden of pollution. You have a burden of increased probability of lung cancer. You have the burden that your child is more likely to have asthma and miss days of school, right? So when we say that there are real tensions, there are because the benefits and burdens of investments are not equally distributed. If you're the person that's going to get all of the toxic pollutants, what do you care if my shampoo is 0.3 of a penny cheaper by volume than it was without that port expansion project? You don't care. You want your kid to be able to go to school and learn, right? So that is when I say we can't all just hold hands and say, let's just spend more money. We have to be cognizant of the fact that these choices have real consequences for people. They can be beneficial in terms of getting people to work more quickly, and that's a good thing. But those can also come with real burdens we have to address.
I'd also argue we can build up to the conversation about funding by talking about outcomes. So what we have traditionally done in transportation is we've said, and this was back in the days where everyone was driving a gas guzzler 2% more per year, which meant we had a windfall at the end of 6 years. And what would happen in Congress, and this is why it was so bipartisan and so easy to get along, was we have 150 to 250 billion more dollars to spend in this bill. How shall we spend it? Ooh, that is a fun bipartisan discussion. And it became less bipartisan and less easy to do when the discussion was, oh shoot, we've got a $30 billion per year dollar gap. That's a little harder. But we're still trying to solve the problem the way we did when we had a windfall, which is we have more money. How are we going to divide up the kitty? And what we need to do now is say, what do we need to accomplish and how much does it cost to do that? And let's guarantee that the money will be dedicated to accomplishing that outcome. We can go and talk about the problems of trucks accessing ports or of getting goods from farmland to those ports in the first place, or of dealing with long commutes. There's just no guarantee that if you put infinite dollars in this program that anything would be done about any of that. So we've got to talk about what we want this program to accomplish, set some goals, put a price tag on it, and then talk about how we raise the money to do that. And we have to put that forward to the American people and say, do you agree with me that that's important? And are you willing to spend this amount of money to do it?
Right. How do we make it matter? Damon, do you want to go back to your public transportation point?
No, I mean, I think it's come up several times on the panel, but so I grew up in I can only speak from personal experience here. I grew up in San Antonio, Texas, Car City, right? And bunch of military bases, and there was one bus I could catch at 5:35 a.m., right? Walking about a mile from my uncle's house where we lived, right? And there was no sidewalk at the time, so I'm standing in the mud or in a puddle or in the street waiting for this bus to come down this major corridor. I had no option, so I did it. If I had the option, actually, I convinced my mom to buy me an $800 car, right? And I would then drive. You see how that works? So instead of taking an hour to school, I took 30 minutes, right? The point is, because we've covered, I love the issues that Kevin brought up, because It's hard to talk about infrastructure alone without talking about environmental impact, right? And the structure of the broader economy. The reason why I was catching that bus was because the school in our neighborhood was terrible. My mom was not going to send me to that school, right? So that's a whole different. That's why we need a Green New Deal, y'all. We need massive public investments to make all the schools great. People can get to them clean. Workers can keep their jobs and do what they do. And there's plenty of pipes to build that fossil fuel workers can work on. We need to replace pipes in Flint. We need to replace pipes in Chicago, where I live. This work has to happen. So again, but back to public transportation. We know that ridership increases when routes are more frequent, right? When drivers have the best equipment, right? And when fares are reduced. And the only way to do that is to change the way we fund public transportation.
There are two things from your story that occur to me that are important to raise. One is your experience of standing in the mud, crossing a street that, makes you play Frogger with your life, or as the young people would call Crossy Roads, in order to get to that bus stop. The way that gets discussed within a DOT or even within Congress is no one likes public transportation. It's shocking that no one likes to take their lives into their own hands to cross the road to get to the bus stop where they stand in the mud, and have to do that at 5:35 in the morning.
And have cars go by at 50 miles an hour.
Right. But that's how it gets discussed, is people don't like public transportation, so we should stop investing in that foolishness. The second thing is I had a very similar experience when I was at Louisiana State University. I needed to get to a job, but there was no way to get there by transit. I actually tried to ride my bike there and almost died so many times.
This is
I
before
quit.
Lyft and Uber and.
I'm so much older than Lyft and Uber, my God. My parents did the same thing. They bought me, an $800, $1,000 car, which was then my lifeline to be able to do everything that I needed to do. But that's quite a lesson that in our society, you have to be able to pay a $1,000 cover charge to be a part of the economy by the way we have chosen to design our roads, and the federal government enforces that design. So again, putting more money into a program that tells me that you can't participate in the economy until you spend $1,000 in the purchase, much less the operations of the vehicle, is quite a statement, and I don't think it should get more money until we change it.
So
That's preaching right there. I can say that. Yeah.
So what's something that the federal government could do, right? If we start with this story, there's a simple thing we could do. We could have the Federal Transit Administration require that every transit operator that received a dime of federal dollars had to go out and measure what percentage of the households in their service area had access within a quarter mile of their front door to high-frequency transit. What if that's a measure that they had to publish every year? And what if that measure affected how much money they got? Or what if that measure affected their ability to compete for grant dollars that didn't come to them by formula but were available in competitive programs, right? What if that's something that we asked them to do? That doesn't require any more money, right? But it does require them to be transparent about the choices they've made. And we could do the same thing on the highway side, right? We could ask different kinds of performance measures on the highway side, or different kinds of performance measures when it came to aviation or drinking water or all flood control. There are all sorts of things, right, that aren't just about money, though we agree we need more of it, right? But we have to start asking real hard questions.
Well, and I would take that. We're working with several states on measuring at the State Department of Transportation level the extent to which the transportation system connects people to jobs and services. And we have found a way to quantify both of those, access to jobs and access to services separately, so that you can design a project around it. So an engineer can actually use this in place of the speed of vehicles as a basis for the design of the roadway. And it turns a lot of our priorities on their heads. Instead of focusing on vehicle speed, you're really focusing on how long it takes for a person to get where they need to go, no matter what mode of transportation they use. We've got the state of Virginia is the furthest ahead in using this, and they use it to evaluate every transportation expansion project, whether it's transit or bike ped or highways. The state of Hawaii has followed suit and is doing the same thing on all of their projects. We're working with the state of Massachusetts now. We're working with Utah and the Wasatch Valley area, and working with the state of Washington as well. We've also gotten some funding put into the Senate bill to provide funding to a handful of states and MPOs, but we would like to see it made available nationwide. Because if you're really looking at whether or not people can get to those destinations and not what their speed is along the way, all of these things we're talking about become natural things you pursue rather than what a lot of the engineers will tell you now, which is, I don't know how to measure that, I kind of know it when I see it.
Larry, do any thoughts come to mind about how does labor feel about public transportation? Are there any issues that come to your mind when we think about public transit and labor position?
Well, as I said, I mean, we're big supporters of public transit. I've got, there are, transit is just about wall to wall in this union, in large part because of smart labor policy and procurement policy. So, it's something that we've long supported. And again, not to, say this too many times, but, we agree that having a real conversation about providing better services, whether it's on the transit side, the commuter rail side, or for people that use highways and roads, sort of is the right answer here. And I think there's agreement on that. I also think there's agreement that, increased funding and revenue is also something that needs to be done here. And, again, as a broad coalition of labor unions, our members need to get to work. And for many of those, they need to go use the city bus or walk too far to get to the subway. So, both from a job perspective and from a commuter perspective, we've been strong supporters of that. There's no daylight there.
Kevin, climate.
Yeah, I think to come back to an earlier point, there was a study that was done, I want to say this was back in 2004, and it looked at Atlanta and Barcelona, Spain. And what was interesting about this is that they computed two things. What were the transportation-related emissions on a per capita basis, and what was the land use? And I want to say that on average, a resident of Atlanta, their transportation activity in a year emitted 7.5 times more than the average resident of Barcelona. And that the geographic footprint, and what's interesting, the reason why they chose those two cities, of course, is at the time they had almost identical populations. But Atlanta was spread out over an area that I want to say was 15 times larger than Barcelona. But Barcelona is not a place that we think of as having, right, the sort of steel canyons of lower Manhattan or sort of massive skyscrapers that we feel are very unlivable. What's interesting about Barcelona as an example, as an alternative form of built environment, is just how fundamentally pleasant it is, I think, if you've ever had a chance to be there. But we have a hard time because we have so many decades of auto-based mobility in terms of how we think about accommodating new population, that it's hard for people to even envision what their life would be like. Like, I'm from Toledo, Ohio, a place that is almost completely auto-dependent and in fact makes many of the vehicles that we all drive around in. And to say to people, there's a different way to do things, I mean, they often look at you in a almost bewildered way, because the day that you turn 16, you get a learner's permit and you get your driver's license as fast as you can, and then you spend, the next 6 decades of your life driving. So one of the challenges that we have is literally trying to get people to imagine something different, but also letting them know that it's not a dichotomy between their suburban, ranch house and the 35th floor of a tower in lower Manhattan, that there are many gradients in between, and that they can be livable places that are perfectly receptible and supportive of families of all different types, right? And in that they have a model in their head that says, well, when I reach a certain age and when I get married, well, then I have to leave the city and I have to go to the suburb and I have to live this kind of way to show them that there's an alternative. You have to start somewhere. So I think my mantra in this process is always, if you don't build anything different, you're never going to get anything different. And oftentimes, the first step down the path towards something more sustainable feels rather jarring, right? If you have a system of roads, justifying the next road is really easy, right? Well, everybody has a car, everybody drives, so we should do a little bit more of that. And then, some recalcitrant person comes up and says, like, well, but what if we actually took away a lane and gave that to the buses? You can't do that. What if we actually had a little bit deeper setback and we had 15-foot sidewalks instead of 3.5-foot sidewalks? can't do that, right? Like those things feel jarring and they feel different. And it's only once you've gone down that alternative and more sustainable path that you begin to see there's a whole different way of doing things. And I think that's a real challenge because we've spent almost a century now doing it one way. And we know that we can't continue to do that or we just aren't going to survive.
Well, and I think it's really important to look at the current system that we have and what it does and what it doesn't do. We have effectively come up with a way to create the maximum amount of congestion with the fewest number of people. That is what the USA has provided for the world. If you go to Google Maps and check out your typical community across the country, but I'm thinking about one in Florida that I use in a lot of my PowerPoint presentations. There's a map of two houses that are 70 yards apart. They're 7.5 miles apart in the only way you can get between them. How could you have anything but horrible emissions and congestion in that situation? We have designed it to generate the maximum congestion with the fewest number of people. These things are all connected. We have, through our land use policies, everything you need is so far from each other and from your house, you have no choice but to drive. And our solution for you on climate is go buy a $30,000 electric vehicle and keep doing it. Keep spending massive amounts of money and massive amounts of your time filling up the roads and sitting in congestion. It will be clean congestion. Won't that be great? And we need to get past that. We need to think about, particularly for the 50% of Americans who are living in poverty today because of how expensive it is to operate, that it is not an effective solution to tell them that they need to have one electric vehicle per person over 16 in their household. That's not acceptable. We need to make it possible for them to cross the street to a destination. My brother lives outside of Baton Rouge. He is 2 blocks into a cul-de-sac. But if you go to the end of his cul-de-sac and you look down what used to be a rural route but is now turned into a suburban arterial, you can see a block away a grocery store. You just can't ever get there by foot. So a 3-block walk is impossible by the way we have designed our roadways. Therefore, even with very low density, you create massive congestion and holdups just to get down to that grocery store, and you emit a ton, even with an electric vehicle that has to plug into something, in order to just go 3 blocks.
And
we've got to do better than that.
And it's also expensive if we step back and think about what is the economic productivity of all this linear infrastructure, right? When you have that many square feet of pavement that has to be constructed and maintained, that's fundamentally supporting not that many people.
And generating a ton of runoff. And
yeah, all sorts of those bad environmental outcomes. But when you think about how many tens of millions of people live in an area where we've had to build thousands of miles of pipes to bring them clean water, and thousands of miles of pipes to take away their dirty water, and millions of miles of roadways, right, that aren't that productive. Well, if we think about what's the daily productivity by comparison of, say, Connecticut Avenue here in the middle of Washington, D.C., it is vastly more economic productive on a per square foot basis than the exurban roadways are outside of Toledo, where,
in many of those communities, if you dedicated all the taxes of the households along them to the roads, which we're not going to do, but if you did, it would take 75 years to come up with enough money to replace those roads, and we need to do it every 25 years.
Right. So I feel like I've been witnessing part political stump speech, part preacher's sermon, and part academic lecture. And at this stage, I'm mindful of the time. I'm going to give a few minutes for Q&A. And so we have a taker already. Yeah, sorry, we snuck up on you there.
Test 1. Thank you. I'm Glenn Fukushima with the Center for American Progress. One issue that I haven't heard anyone talk about is technology. I would really be very interested to know what IT, robotics, AI, what that is going to do in terms of impact on infrastructure and how we can best use that technology, because I sense that we're talking about the past and the present. I didn't really get much in terms of what you think technology can do for us, both good and bad.
Yeah, I think there are some really down in the weeds things, like right now, if you want to inspect a bridge and figure out if it's structurally deficient, oftentimes you got to get a person with a hard hat and put them in a cherry picker and have them, physically go and look at the underside of a bridge to figure out, how rusty is the steel, how cracked is the concrete. There are some places where you're going to get advances in robotics and in drones and in algorithms that can look at those video streams and flag for people when bridges might be in bad condition. There are lots of things in sort of the civil engineering side of it where I think we're going to see costs come down to do some of the basic work that we have to do for the system. I think if we're having a broader conversation about the direction of technology, the thing that most people bring up when they think about AI and robotics or autonomous vehicles, I would say that that future is a good bit further off than a lot of the sort of breathless press reports would have you believe. There's still a great deal of work that has to be done. But more importantly, I come back to a line that there's a transportation writer named Jarrett Walker who always says, technology does not change geometry. And I think that's something that's vital to remember. So we have a system that is built around giant metal boxes with 4 wheels that take up an awful lot of space. And whether or not those are being driven by a person or being driven by a computer doesn't really change the fact that they're big metal boxes with wheels. Now, it is true that when you have professors of civil and environmental engineering set up models and try to figure out, okay, well, if we have a 4-lane highway and we had 30% penetration of AVs, or we had 75% penetration or 100% penetration, what does that do to the flow rate? And you get people battling over estimates like, well, our standard human-driven cars, we get 21 or 2,200 vehicles per hour, per lane, per direction on a limited access highway. Some people say we might get 3,100 if we had all AVs. Some people say, oh, we might get to 4,000 if we all had AVs. Okay, there's some interest in that from my perspective. I think we should recognize that that's still like a step up. It's not a revolutionary change. You still got big metal boxes that have to go someplace. So even if you were to increase the flow rate of, say, I-66 coming into Washington, D.C. from Northern Virginia, it still doesn't change the fact that when you get onto this side of the river, it's not a highway anymore, it's a city. So even if that highway were capable of carrying more vehicles per hour, you still don't have any place to put them. So I think we should recognize that there are real limitations to what autonomous vehicles and other forms of advanced transportation technology are actually going to do and what they mean. And yeah.
I have a positive and a negative on that too. On the AVs, I am equally as skeptical about how useful they will be. If we still have the current policies, particularly pricing policies, that encourage people to waste their car usage and waste the space within the car, it could be truly disastrous. You could have traffic jams full of empty vehicles. Yep. Right now, it would be, I think probably 50% of this room can, let's say it honestly, 100% of this room can come up with a situation where you'd let your AV circle the block while you were running an errand. That's a problem. So we need to get our arms around zero occupancy vehicles because they're coming, and what sort of pricing policy is needed to manage them because they could be a true disaster. On the other hand, there are some real positives. Like it's technology that is allowing us to quantify access to jobs and services. We have GIS that tells us where all the houses are and where all the destinations are. We have traffic congestion data that we can use to calculate how long it takes to drive between 2 places. We can go into a map and draw a new piece of infrastructure and see how it changes that in an instant. We have a GTFS feed that tells us how the transit system is operating. We know what the speeds of the roadway are, so we know which ones are dangerous to bicyclists and pedestrians and which ones aren't. I mean, this is just completely earth-shattering changes for the planning and the engineering of our roadways. So there's some real excitement, but we need to recognize there's a policy issue here, and technology doesn't get us out of the policy.
Can I say, look, obviously, we're talking about automation from a worker perspective. Look, I don't know how quickly all this will come to be, and quite frankly, no one really does. But there are a lot of corporations spending billions and billions of dollars on AI and specifically AV technologies here. Look, the labor movement, we want to embrace new technology. There's a way to integrate this stuff make transportation, make infrastructure safer, more efficient. But at the same time, we have to make sure that these are real jobs on the table. And as I said at the outset, we're here at this panel, we're here in this debate, because these are sectors that create and sustain good jobs across this country. And whether it's AVs, whether it's automation on trains, whether it's different types of automation on the airline side, we want to make sure that the labor movement, that frontline workers is part of that future, whether that's federal transition, whether that's the right training programs, whether that's making sure that we don't implement this technology too fast from a safety perspective, I think are all issues that we have to think real carefully about and make sure that the frontline worker perspective isn't lost in that.
I'm mindful of the time. We have about 3 minutes left. I'm going to apologize to the audience because I have to cut off Q&A. What I'd like to do is give each of our panelists, I gave you all fair warning. You have actually less than a minute now. This is your legacy moment for this panel. What do you want to be remembered? What are your closing remarks that you'd like to leave with the audience? And at least some of us will be around for, I should say some of them will be around for questions afterwards. But we'll start with, Damon's avoiding my eye contact, so I'm going to start with, start with Damon.
No, so it's been a pleasure being on the panel. I've learned so much as I did on the prep call, so excited to be here, and thank you for the invitation. I just think it's important that we rethink and really challenge some of the assumptions that we have in solving some of these problems. I think there are slight changes in how we think, change the law here, change the law there, rethink how we fund things here and there, and we can do a lot and get more of what we want.
Thank you. Larry.
Well, look, I think you've moderated a great panel. I think we've all had a chance to share sort of our top line views. Not to go back too much on the earlier discussion, but as we do think about sort of different outcomes and about how to talk about these issues and how to get some of these things done a little bit differently, we do have to remind ourselves that this is a big country, geographically and politically, and the policy solutions and discussions that may work for many of us, including myself, that live close to Washington, D.C. and what have you, might be a little different if you live in a different part of the country. And that's, quite frankly, where a lot of our members live. So we should all just think about that as we're thinking about the right outcomes in transportation and infrastructure.
Kevin.
I think that's a wonderful point. Thank you for making it. I would just say that there's no reason why we can't have shared goals and let other people figure out the best way to get there, right? So that heterogeneity in terms of the lived experience, in terms of the built environment, there's no reason why we still all can't be pulling in the same direction.
And Beth.
So I would say it's going to be incumbent on us, the stakeholders and the folks who are interested in this, to make clear what the priorities of the program should be. The downside of this trust fund is that folks on Capitol Hill do not discuss transportation. They don't tend to have a real transportation staffer. They have a tax staffer that takes up transportation once every 6 or 8 years, or an environmental staffer that gets stuck with the issue and isn't so thrilled about it. So it's going to be really incumbent on us to say, this is what we expect to happen from this program, and this is where your program's falling short. Otherwise, you just cannot assume that the folks on Capitol Hill are aware.
I hope you all enjoyed this panel as much as I did, and I want to give a hearty thanks to our great panelists. Thank you so much for all the time and energy.
Thank you.